Today I'm reviewing the ATC EL50, which is a high-end active speaker. As you may know, there are technical reasons that active speakers can be advantaged, and as a result, I've covered a few of these speakers in the last year or so. ATC is also noteworthy as a major pro audio speaker maker, and I've had good experiences with some pro speakers, and active setups are common in that world, so it seemed interesting to try an active speaker from a pro company. The EL50 thankfully skips the industrial cosmetics typical in the pro world, since it has a consumer-only aesthetic. Let's take a look at the results. All right, let's start with a product description. As I said, the EL50 is an active speaker. Because active speakers, by which we mean speakers that have electronic crossovers and amplifiers built in, are somewhat rare, let me articulate some of the benefits of active speakers. The standard active speaker makes two big changes relative to passive speakers. First, an amplifier is provided for each driver, not for the whole speaker. So a three-way speaker like the EL50 will have 3 amplifiers per channel. Second, the crossover, necessary because none of the drivers covers the full musical frequency range, is implemented with line-level electronic circuits, active op-amps plus passive components, not with purely passive high-level components like resistors, capacitors, and inductors. The electronic crossover is in circuit before the amps, whereas passive crossovers are in circuit after the amplifier. So an active speaker will have completely different crossover circuitry and generally more complex amplification. You might ask, why would you bother? Well, active speakers have many possible advantages. For example, amplifier power is not consumed by the passive crossover components, meaning that amplifiers in an active speaker can be a bit less powerful for the same acoustic output as with a passive speaker. The active amps also generally face a less demanding load and will face less impedance variation with output level. Then, electronic crossover circuits can execute crossover curves and timing adjustments that are difficult to do with passive components. For example, very high crossover slopes or complex phase correction. And electronic circuits may more easily or more artfully execute user-enabled adjustments to speaker parameters like frequency response. And amplifiers can be tailored to individual drivers. KEF, for example, uses Class D amps on bass drivers and Class AB amps for tweeters, and these have different power levels as needed by each driver. Similarly, active crossovers can more easily be tuned to specific driver electrical variations stemming from production tolerances. Given these and other advantages, you might ask, why are passive speakers so prevalent? Part of this is history. Passive speakers have been the norm for a long time, and it's difficult and costly to get audiophiles to switch architectures. And part of this comes down to the desire among audiophiles to tune their systems with amplifier speaker matching. The EL50's amplifier complement consists of Class AB amps rated at 200 watts for the woofer, 100 watts for the mid-range, and 50 watts for the tweeter. So, 350 watts per channel. I bring this up in part to create the context for the pricing of the EL50, which is $100,000 per pair. Hard as it may be, you might think of the EL50 as a $60,000 speaker with a big $40,000 amplifier on board. This assumes you'd spend about as much on an amp as on the speakers, which is not, of course, a requirement of audio physics, but is a typical kind of rule of thumb. And if you're not interested in this class of equipment, you're free now to try that Ridge Vineyards Cabernet that's waiting in the cellar. Connections to the EL50 are simple. There are XLR analog inputs on each speaker. I connected a Master Fidelity NADAC-D DAC fed by an Orander N20 streamer to these inputs. If you had a streamer with a DAC and volume control on board, you could build a 3-box system around the EL50. For consistency, I used the Solution 326 preamp, which also facilitates switching among multiple sources like turntables and tape decks. The driver complement on the EL50 is also simple. This is a 3-way speaker with a 9-inch ported woofer, a 3-inch dome mid-range, and a 1-inch dome tweeter. The curved and braced wood cabinet is 56 inches tall, 18 inches wide, and 14 inches deep. Those straightforward specs don't exactly prepare you for the sound offered by the EL50. With that teaser, let's diffuse the tension by getting right to sound quality. Remember, my job is to objectively observe what products do with reference to the absolute sound. Your job is to assess whether those things suit your musical and sonic priorities. I need to say up front that the EL50 sounds different in fundamental terms than the typical excellent $50,000 speaker and $50,000 amp combination. I'll do specific comparisons later, but I think the EL50 requires a more macro perspective than is typical in reviews, where we attempt to resolve the fine differences between products that differ mainly in important details. The fundamental thing with the EL50 is that it sounds big and dynamic without the downsides of technologies that are often used to generate these adjectives. I also note that both big and dynamic do not always and maybe not often go together in one product. They do, however, work well together as part of a sonic profile, at least if there aren't big trade-offs. The EL50 mostly avoids trade-offs to deliver its essential goodness. All right, let's talk about imaging. Let me expand on this idea of a big sound. A fundamental element of what we call believability is that the size of the sound stage presented by the speaker is appropriate to the kind of music being played. A chamber quartet with 4 performers in a small venue, and Mahler's 8th Symphony with 300 performers in a large concert hall do not present the same image scale when experienced in person. The same thing is true comparing a solo guitarist with a 12-piece rock or jazz band. With that as a reference, many stereo systems present a somewhat compressed image both vertically and horizontally. The EL50 largely avoids this. The soundstage isn't vertically truncated, which is impressive, though there are a few speakers that might produce a debatably beneficial sense of even greater image height, this being something of an effect, not pure reproduction. Adding to this, the EL50 has the most articulated, wide lateral soundstage rendering on the right recordings that I've heard outside of systems using Bach crosstalk cancellation. The EL50 can create an image wider than the speakers, and it does this with a strong sense of performer placement. Remember, we're talking here about soundstage presentation, which is placement of the performers, not sound space presentation, the sense of ambient information reflected from the surfaces of the club or hall. Sound space should, of course, mostly seem to come from outside the stage area, though with stereo equipment, that's not a given. To give an example of what the EL50 can do, on Tool's Chocolate Chip Trip, a keyboard is panned across the stage and then around the left side of the room. The EL50 locates the sound precisely and can do this up to more than 90 degrees off the central axis, i.e. 90 degrees away from straight ahead. That may seem like kind of a party trick, but the ability to get the image disconnected from the actual source, the speakers, and do what stereo can do, which is to place the sounds in space using phase and level information, is an important element of believability for some listeners. The EL50 does this with some regularity when the recording allows, and for a contrast with studio electronica like Tool, I noticed this, for example, on East West, which is small ensemble jazz from Bill Frisell, recorded live. Okay, then let's talk about dynamics. The EL50 has a kind of dynamic freedom that I think is closer to the absolute sound than we typically associate with speakers that are called dynamic. My reviews of speakers have, I think, revealed the tendency of speakers with a dynamic reputation to confine their special dynamic sauce to a limited frequency band. This makes their dynamics stand out more obviously, but over time, this dynamic signature can sound a little off because real music has dynamic passages at various frequencies across the spectrum. The degree of coherence or incoherence varies with each speaker, but it does seem to relate to driver technologies chosen for the design. A horn mid-range tweeter married to a cone woofer may have more dynamic coherence issues than a full-range horn or a full-range dynamic design. In the event, I found the dynamics of the EL50 to be excellent, with less look-at-me showmanship and more musically realistic coherence. Bass, mid-range, and treble all have good drive, but they never seem overwrought. The one exception here is the low bass, which I'll talk about in the next section. Okay, I think the bass of the EL50 is distinctive, and that is mostly a good thing looking across the spectrum of listener preferences, but you need to decide. First, the EL50 mid-bass is slightly elevated, and I think that's what at least 50% of listeners want. A slight elevation gives you a solid foundation on many recordings, even if the mastering or your room isn't exactly ideal. You can also more easily relax into a track when your mind isn't asking, but where's the bass? A basic element of much modern music. The voicing that impressed me the most is the way the EL50 handles upper bass. The EL50 threads a needle by having a touch more upper bass than many speakers, which can be deficient in this region. And the ATC also has smoother upper bass and more dynamic upper bass than many speakers. At the same time, this tuning almost never gets thick or blurry. In fact, the overall impression left by the EL50 upper bass is one of higher bass resolution than is typical even on very good speakers. This approach generates a texture to bass that makes drums and double basses sound especially rich and dynamic. It isn't more dynamic in the punchy sense, it's more dynamic in the sense of aliveness. I'm skeptical of linking technology to sound quality, but I do note that the woofer on the EL50 is mounted physically much higher than is typical. This may move the floor bounce frequency above the woofer's range, or I may be dreaming. Even so, the observation stands. Low bass on the EL50 could be a trade-off for some. If you favor electronic music or organ, you may find that the output below 40 Hz is insufficient. Many speakers roll off in this region, but slopes and turnover points vary. I thought the EL50 sounded quite musical on my low bass test tracks, but certainly some output, especially the kind and level that activates the room, was truncated. Now let's talk about trade-offs. Every speaker has trade-offs. They're often more subtle as the price rises, but you probably get more picky at those levels too. Anyway, the EL50 has 3 noteworthy trade-offs from my testing. First, the aforementioned bottom octave, 20 to 40 Hz, let's say, reticence. Second, treble balance that is probably flat, but therefore does little to ameliorate the label's tendency to issue hot recordings. And third, the need for at least moderate levels to come alive, making the EL50 less than ideal if your primary listening is late at night in a condominium where volume must be kept quite low. All right, then let's do some comparisons. I started this review positioning the EL50 as a $50,000 speaker or a $60,000 speaker with a $40,000 or $50,000 amp. I'll use that framework for my comparisons. Remember that I haven't heard everything, so I have to select from what I actually have heard under good conditions. The EL50 presents a case where I think comparisons are quite instructive, but perhaps in a different way than traditionally. The 2 obvious comparisons are with the Wilson Sasha V and the Magico S3. Both the Wilson and the Magico have a similar slight roll-off in the bottom octave. In this regard, all 3 speakers demonstrate that a pretty small percentage of music is actually affected by this. Solid response to 40 Hz covers almost all standard instruments. All 3 speakers have generally balanced voicing, which isn't to say that they're voiced in the same way, but that there are speakers that deviate much more significantly from neutral, and often intentionally so. Most of these come from the acoustic distortion reduction or frequency shaping philosophies, and not from the linear transparent realm of the ATC, Magico, or Wilson. I do think the Wilson makes the most effort and concessions toward the strange world of real recordings, and the ATC perhaps the least, though this may reflect my sensitivity to imbalanced treble in recordings. At the same time, I think that the Magico comes across as the most transparent, with the ATC not far behind. I should emphasize these distinctions because listeners tend to think of voicing as a primary variable, and it may fade over time. You'll notice these things in a 15-minute initial A/B listening session, but with days and weeks of ownership, they may fade in significance. You should be the judge, of course. When it comes to sound staging, the differences are more pronounced over time. The sound stage of the ATC can simply be larger when called for. I think this is helpful at times, but there are clearly listeners for whom this is not musically important. The less you attend concerts or the less you listen to music made with acoustic instruments, the less you may care about this. Also, the larger soundstage isn't nearly as significant on smaller scale music, and there the precision of the Magico especially may be rewarding. But you should be the judge because the interest in sound staging seems very listener dependent. Finally, I think there's a macro perspective that you might care about. The traditional term for this is naturalness, though that sometimes has meant a soft, relaxed sound. That isn't what I mean. I'm pointing to something more like coherence, because real music in real spaces is coherent. The different qualities don't sound patched together when you're listening. I think in relative terms, the ATC works quite well in this regard, although it does call your attention to certain audio qualities like bass definition and treble clarity. This can be exciting and rewarding, or for a few listeners, it can be slightly distracting. None of these competitive speakers is perfect in this regard, but the S3 is probably the most greater than the sum of the parts of these three speakers. The Magico S5 and the Tidal Contriva extend this coherence and might be considered relevant if you can find a suitable amp that fits within your budget with the price of those speakers. As always, your assessment of these potentially important factors is bound to depend on your music. To expand on this, the EL50 strikes me as especially effective on studio power music, whether using small or large groups. The ATC EL50 is more different than most cones-in-a-box speakers. The differences are almost entirely in variables that I think will be rewarding to many listeners. This is a speaker that you should hear because of that. Splitting hairs in audio can be an exercise in frustration, and the EL50 is a bit of an antidote. The EL50 offers big difference makers with a superb combination of imaging, dynamics, and detail. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the ATC EL50 active loudspeaker system. If you have, we invite you to check out our many other videos and written reviews. And you can subscribe to our free weekly newsletters to get updates on new material. Thanks for watching.